Hello everyone, Alexa Donne here, and today at long last I am doing my niche but popular edits deep dive into the Ivies. Thus far I have done this for every one of my published books where I take you through from like draft 1, like draft 0 if you will, all the way through to the published book, trying to remember as best as I can and give you as many details as possible, which means spoilers. The whole video is spoilers of like how it started and how it ended. These are fun to look at the journey of a book and see how much a book changes even when you are a professional writer, that you're never going to be publishing your first draft. All books are made in editing, essentially. And as you'll see when I go through this, it's the same on every book. Some of my favorite elements of my final published books were made in the editing, and in many cases are because my editor pushed me. I love editing. I'd say I love editing more than drafting. So come along with me and see how the Ivies grew and changed. So I drafted the Ivies from late January 2019 to early May 2019. I actually vlogged it, so there's evidence of all of this. And I sent it to my agent on May 18th. The first draft was 73,000 words and it published at about like a little over 84,000 words. So over the course of edits, I cut stuff but then clearly I added stuff. So my agent sent me notes on May 21st, which auspicious timing. We get to talk about the weird, like it mostly impacts the timeline of editing this book. I found out my mom was dying 4 days after my agent sent her notes. So macabre. I can talk about it now because it's been a couple of years. So that means I didn't end up revising the book until July because for very understandable reasons, my brain was like, no, especially like it's a murder book, it's a death book. Because my mom ended up dying in early June. Honestly, I think it's kind of a miracle I ended up revising in July. Like I started revisions in July, but basically I was fueled by, my first plan before life implosion was to get this on sub late spring, early summer. We really wanted to strike while the iron is hot because, as I'm going to talk about with this first draft, I was halfway done with it when the whole Operation Varsity Blues college admissions scandal broke. That was mid-March and I was almost exactly at the midpoint when that happened. And so like I'm texting my agent like, well, I need to finish this book as soon as possible. We need to go on submission as soon as possible. But I didn't manage to start those edits until July. I got it to my agent in August. She normally has a really fast turnaround. So it was like 2 to 3 weeks of back and forth, having an intern read it, me doing some more revision before we went on submission in late September. So what was in that first draft, that thing that I sent to my agent, and how did it change in the course of the edits of what went on submission? So first of all, as always, just a process thing. Like with every book so far, I got right up to the end. Like I wrote the climax with Tyler and the Ethan reveal and the big showdown with Avery, and then I got really stuck. So I went back to the beginning. I did a continuity pass before finishing it for that May 8th date. And in fact, I actually think I finished it on May 4th, but I sent it to my agent on May 8th. So the biggest difference between that first draft that my agent read and the edits that she sent back and what we put on submission is Olivia. So in the first draft of the Ivies, the most striking thing that really changed over the course of edits period, because I did further edits to Olivia as a character and the arc, which impacted the whole book when I sold it, was in the original draft, the tone was way darker in the sense that the tone was very wry, very knowing, and Olivia was intentionally kind of a bad person. It was a lot more like straight down the middle, snarky, I know I'm a bad person, but would someone really want to kill one of us? It was essentially a more self-aware mean girl kind of story, and it had that tone, and thus Olivia was kind of a tricky character. And my agent asked me the question. She said, like, Olivia currently is waffling in this draft, this first draft, between I'm a bad girl and I know it, but ooh, my friends are so much worse than I thought. What does that mean? So then she would go to kind of like guilt and shame, and it was wibbly wobbling between the two, and she was like, pick. She's either unlikable or she's a more relatable protagonist. And for submission, honestly, I picked both the easiest choice, the easier choice, which it was way easier to lean into her being unlikable because she was already kind of crafted that way. And also I was like, this is my intention and this is the tone. And I'll talk about a few other things that were in that first draft that got cut in just a second that spoke to that tone. So I made that choice to go all the way. I removed really anything where Olivia was waffling on certain things and feeling bad about certain things. So the book still had that aspect of her finding out that her friends did stuff that she didn't know about and that her friends were worse than her, but it was like, it's like a tiered cake, and like, let's say Olivia's like on the second tier and there's like that top tier, and in the course of all the edits, if you've read the final book, I took Olivia down to the bottom tier of that cake. So she has a lot further to climb, a lot further to fall as well in terms of realizing who her friends were. That's the spoiler for what I ended up doing. I think it's hilarious that I went in the opposite direction. Before submission, we kept her unlikable. To this end, I had a few like little bits in the book that spoke to this tone, that were meant to be glib and wry and a little bit extra satirical. Obviously, some of the satirical edge stayed in the book, but the final book ended up being a lot more grounded. I literally had a frequently asked questions about the Ivies chapter. And I actually, like, I was very fond of it, and I ended up rewriting it as narrative at my agent's suggestion for submission, and then that later became the prologue. So like, clearly when I rewrote it for narrative, my editor it stuck out and got moved into the prologue. I also had something at the end to go with this wry tone that was a whole chapter of like media clippings of reaction to the whole thing. That included, I think it was another FAQ type thing, but from the school. It was like the letter from the school to parents or to the media with like addressing the frequently asked questions about the scandal, and that got thrown out. That whole chapter got thrown out completely. So the original ending, which we're going to talk about, was just straight up narrative. Another thing that changed between first draft and submission draft, and honestly again in the final draft, I rewrote my main cop character and like who she was and how she reacted to Olivia each time I edited this book. So basically Cataldo got rewritten 3 times. On the first draft, I went a lot more on like cautious, like ally almost, where she related to Olivia on a certain level and they were almost like chummy at points. That got a rewrite for submission to make her more antagonistic to increase the tension. And I did keep that, but on the next pass after I had sold it, like it just smoothing it so that the arc of tension in each individual scene with Cataldo was fine-tuned and sharpened. And that's actually a pro tip for me when you're editing a book like this, a thriller like this. Always look to your like cop, law enforcement, not antagonist, but like main obstacle character scenes to fine-tune for tension. You'd be amazed with like little changes to lines of dialogue, to reaction, how it'll just completely transform a scene and transform how little sections of your book work pacing wise. So Cataldo got an edit. So the other thing that was like this is just like the discovery writing process of a first draft. So this brings us to the whole college admissions scandal thing and questions of like which of like your twists and whatnot were in the first draft. So the SAT scam aspect of the Ivies had a journey. So my original brainstorming, because we know I don't outline, but I do bullet pointed lists of like things I think I would like to put into a book, and right on there was SAT scam question mark. So this is when I was developing it in December and January, and I started to write it. I went to a writer's retreat in February, and I was getting up to the midpoint before the scandal broke, and I even discussed it with my friends at the retreat, like, is it too much to do this? It's probably too much. Like, I already have so much drama in this book. SAT scam just really takes it to the next level. I don't know, I might not need it. And then the federal scandal happened, and I went, okay, yeah, that's going in the book. Like, truth is stranger than fiction. It wasn't too over the top, and clearly became a backbone to a lot of the tension for the book. Because once I decided to have it, I had to decide how it worked, and I didn't do what Rick Singer did, because there are far more simple ways to cheat the SAT. Theoretically simple ways that would certainly work better for a student being behind it. But once I started like getting into that, on that first draft, it kind of appears in the middle of the book. So this is also totally kosher. You can fix foreshadowing later, so that bringing it up to submission draft, I threaded it through the book better. Spoiler alert, I ended up doing that one more time with my editor, like even better clues. But that's the thing, it was fine-tuning how the scam worked between first draft to submission draft. Kind of deepening the conflict and implications in terms of how Emma was specifically using Olivia, like, and actually the innovation of the ID card part of the scam, I can't even remember if that was in my submission draft or if I did that with my editor, but it definitely was not in my first draft. Like, just like how beautifully, perfectly it all fell into line. I really didn't have to change anything. That was all just beautiful additions that slotted in perfectly to her work study job. And I was like, that's the beauty of discovery writing for me. And like, I've just gotten accustomed to it where I can do this. When I write my thrillers, I create frameworks that I can easily slot changes and twists and foreshadowing into later. So beyond those big things, my past with my agent, it was standard things, like little continuity things I had missed. I never stated the cause of death in the first draft, and she was like, you should probably do that. So I added that in. There were a couple of suspects and twists that felt too obvious, and so it was tweaking and fine-tuning those. There's always going to be, at least I find for thrillers, every single draft, you're gonna do more layering. You need to like make some things less obvious and some things more obvious. The other thing I did have in the original draft, I had a funeral scene. It was more like a wake scene, and it happened pretty quickly. Like, timeline was also something that got tweaked repeatedly throughout, and when I did my final pass, like my big edit with my editor, we tightened the timeline. It was a little longer in the first and submission draft, and my agent was like, this is way too soon. Unless Emma is Jewish, most people don't have a funeral within 24 to 48 hours. This is making the pacing feel a little weird and frenetic in a bad way. So I changed it to what became a pretty anchoring school assembly memorial scene. That's an anchor point in before that break into two. So that change happened between first draft and submission draft, though it got fine-tuned and made better with my editor. And that was all about pacing, because it previously was like, we go to Boston for a funeral, and then we go back to school, and then we meet with the detective later. And instead I whoofed those all together. Just helps with tension and pacing. So now let's talk about the original ending of the Ivies, the submission version of the ending, which, other than throwing out that like satirical FAQ-ish chapter, didn't change much between first draft and submission draft. So now we move into submission draft, selling this book, and the critical changes it underwent to become the Ivies as we know it. So the original ending, I've talked about this before, but now I can talk full spoilers. It was the polar opposite. I wrote a bog standard ending to this YA thriller. One that honestly, it wasn't bad. It's not wrong. But making one critical change altered the tonal landscape of where the book went and how the book goes down as a whole. And I'm really, really happy with the final version. But it's so funny because it's like this alternate universe version that is like a pretty pat, normal YA thriller ending. So originally, because I was thinking, how would this go in real life? Remember the federal scandal. Though there hadn't been convictions and whatnot yet, but I know how this works. I was like, the rich never, like the truly mega wealthy and super privileged aren't really ever gonna face real consequences for something like this. So what would I do if I was in this situation if I wasn't me? What would Catherine Montfort do, Avery's mother, where Tyler's a big old murderer and her baby cheated on the SAT? Because in this original version, including the one I sold, Avery knowingly cheated. I changed that because my editor loved Avery so much and was like, can we just have like pull back on Avery being like a bad guy a little bit? So we redeemed Avery slightly where she did not know that her mother had done this for her. That was a change that I'm pretty happy with for the final draft. But originally, what would Catherine Montfort do? Catherine Montfort would bribe and pay off Cataldo to bury this all under the rug, because that's basically where I landed with it. And thus we get our happy ending. So in our happy ending, when people are paid off and this is kept a secret, and the school wouldn't want the scandal to get out, so everyone's cool with it. And everyone lived happily ever after. I don't even mention what happens to Tyler. It's kind of left happily open-ended where you assume justice is done. Everyone more or less gets to go to the schools that they want to go to because there are no acceptances rescinded because there's no scandal about cheating. And so Olivia actually exercises a little bit of agency. She turns down Harvard. I know that sounds unbelievable, but she decides it's tainted by Emma's murder and the whole thing. She ends up going to Boston University for journalism because that's where I went to school, and you know, Olivia wants to be a journalist. Ethan goes to Harvard. They're still in a relationship, so the implication is they're gonna date when they go to college. Now, Avery, Sierra, and Margot all end up at the same schools ultimately in the change ending as well, but what changes is how they end up there. Overall, the only person really impacted between the two endings is Olivia. The final scene is a mirror scene to the first scene where they're in the cafeteria. It's April, it's regular decision, it's all over, everyone has their decisions and knows where they're going, and Olivia reflects on her friends and how like she misses Emma and like she hates that she's an Ivy, but she wouldn't have it any other way. And yes, you do have the opportunity to read the original ending. My publisher, Random House Get Underline, is putting it up on their blog, so you will find a link to that down below, provided it is up at the time of this posting. If not, I will post it later, but you can now read the original ending of the Ivies. I call it a happy ending. It was more that the original intention of the original ending was people with money make things like this go away, so everyone ends up relatively happy. Olivia gets to make her own choice about where she is going to school, and she salvages her relationship with Ethan because she is able to get over the betrayal with the whole SAT test taker thing. So Crown wants to buy my book. My wonderful editor, Elizabeth Stranahan, wants to buy my book, and we get on a call before they make the official offer because she wants to run her edits by me to make sure I'm okay with them because they were relatively major, though maybe this is just how I like truck with editing. Like, yes, technically, and it was a lot of work, but like it all feels organic to me. And like, well, I mean, I was on board with the edits. Clearly I was very much like, your notes make sense and I'm excited by them. And those main notes were change Olivia's entire character arc to make her likable and pull it back, that she's less knowing about what her friends were doing, far more in the dark, far more of an outsider, and a part of the mystery arc now becomes discovering more about her friends. It was a big edit, but I think it was definitely worth it. A part of me is like, oh, I love that unlikable protagonist Olivia, but instead she gets to grow into that person, which some people don't like, but I love a good negative character arc. I guess the irony being that in the original ending, it was like the opposite. She starts as like a very bad person and becomes less worse, but we love to destroy people in this house. And so the other note was, It wasn't don't have a happy ending. It was they wanted to see, it was my editor Elizabeth Stranahan and Phoebe Yeh, who was the publisher of Crown, who had both read my book. I still cannot believe that Phoebe read my book. They wanted to see justice done, in quotes. They wanted to see a permutation, an ending of this book where the SAT scam wasn't swept under the rug. Because in light of Operation Varsity Blues, you know, everyone is more aware of this now and is out for blood, right? And I said, I am open to that. Now's a good time to talk about the things that never changed over the course of the drafts, just things that you might be curious about. So, the murder and the motive never changed. Asterisk. The motive, I worked backwards from a motive for this book, because now I can speak in terms of spoilers. The genesis of this always was, what if someone killed someone in order to write a college admissions essay about it? What kind of sociopath would do that? So exciting. There's an alternate universe version of this book where Avery is the killer, but then I fell in love with her a little bit too much, and I was like, if we're gonna go with a boyfriend, I'll at least subvert the it's always the boyfriend trope in that the motive can be a little surprising because it's not about the cheating. Now, the other big thing that comes up a lot, and I have hinted about this in spoiler-free videos and many people have figured this out, Ethan as the other test taker. This was an in-the-moment decision, but as I was drafting the first draft, but once I landed on it, it was just perfect. The foreshadowing slotted in so perfectly, it's like my subconscious brain knew that I was gonna do this, and then from that point on, it never changed. Avery. Avery was always a badass bitch. Avery was always queer, but how that manifested on the page changed over the drafts. As I said, my editor loves Avery as much as I do, and so we pulled her back a little bit from the levels of bitchery and a lot of that kind of more intentional antagonism and like backstabbiness and whatnot were given to our lovely victim, Emma. The other thing that has never changed, that third act climax at the Montfort mansion, I knew before I started the book, this was my cookie thing I was writing toward, that it was gonna be a New Year's Eve party at an isolated mansion. I always knew it would be like finding something on the computer inside during the party as like the thump thump is going on. That was always like the sense in my mind, and I knew that the big confrontation would always be in the woods. We love a woods book, so that always stayed consistent, and other than tightening, really never changed from first draft to final draft. The other thing that didn't change substantively is the progression up to the murder. So that like first part of Act 1, it got trimmed and fine-tuned, but never really substantively changed. Overall, the bulk of my edits, and this is very common for me certainly, Act 2. Act 2, middles are always really, really hard, and they're really critical in thrillers. So that's where I did the bulk of my edits, plus completely changing the ending. Moving back to like actual changes, another thing that changed over multiple drafts, I forgot to say before, one of my agent's notes was that she really wanted the Ivies, because that's the point, that's the name of the book, as a friend group to feel more cohesive before the murder, so that there's more of a status quo establishment before everything changes. And so that was also something I did before the submission draft, adding, that's when I added the team meeting in Avery's room before the party to kind of like gel that together. And then I did more of that with my editor because we ended up having that wonderful bathroom scene, which is now a favorite of mine. This is a response to an editor note where at the memorial, they were originally just like sitting in the room and like meeting and talking. And then they went to Avery's dorm room to kind of strategize about the cops. And I changed it to the bathroom at my editor's suggestion and inserted Cataldo into the mix to like up the tension and make it a lot more menacing and tighten the pacing. So this brings up another thing that was just like a consistent like issue that's definitely worth talking about. And you know, I'll share this not to say that I nailed it, because I don't think I did, but to say that if you struggle with this too, welcome. It is really hard to juggle large casts, especially like central casts of like friend groups, it's really, really challenging. Inevitably, some characters are going to get short shrift, and it's actually why I made that joke in the Ivies why there aren't 8 of them, because 5 in a friend group is already unwieldy. 5 in a friend group is unwieldy for an author, even when you kill one and you have 4 left. And so in the original draft, Sierra and Margot definitely got the shortest shrift. And so I had to... Margot was always designed as a character. Because I've had these friend group situations for myself before. I was like, Margot is the character who, like, you're brought together by a central figure, in this case Avery, but like you're on like opposite ends of the circle and you never quite connect. Margot is that character that doesn't really like Olivia, and Olivia can feel that, so they're not really close. And so that never changed, but I did gave Margot an extra scene over the course of the drafts with Olivia, trying to kind of feel out their relationship a little bit better. Sierra really changed the most, where I was like, okay, after Emma dies, it can't just be all Avery all the time. Sierra can be built up as an interesting foil friend character to Olivia. So I worked on her in the submission draft, and then even more with my editor. And I ended up really liking the idea, like, because you're always going to fine-tune your characters. And the Ivies, like, I had to think, like, how does this 5-person friend group function? Like, why is everyone here? And I ended up really liking how Sierra... My thought was, Sierra is the one in the friend group who doesn't need to cheat. Though I guess the question is, do any of them need to cheat? They're all privileged and academically talented, but obviously they take it to that next level to not so much cheat, sabotage, in order to increase their odds, and that's what makes it so icky. But my thought was, Sierra fell in with this group more, not because she needed them to sabotage on her behalf, but to cover her own ass, to protect herself from them sabotaging her. And once that clicked into place, it just clarified for me how she would interact with Olivia and Avery and so on. And so I really fine-tuned her role in the story. But ultimately, honestly, I had a lot of characters, and I can't say, like, Margot has a whole inner life as a character and perspective on the story that exists that just couldn't make it onto the page because pacing. And that's always just like sad. And I've got the same thing in Pretty Dead Queens, where it's like, I have a lot of people, and it's just, it's always going to be hard to balance a cast, and you're going to have to make decisions. So, but that is something I actively worked on draft to draft. And just so you know, like, the specific things, having Sierra visit Olivia at her work study was an addition. Them teaming up at the party was an addition. Before they were doing their jobs solo, but doing teams, like, enabled me to have a little bit more friend interaction. And having Sierra check in with her after her Cataldo interview was also something that I added for the submission draft as like a tension thing, like having one of the friends turn the screws, and then it got refined with my editor to make it more tense. Just a funny little thing in terms of like changes, names. Most of the characters, their names didn't change except for 2. Avery was originally named Madison, and Margot was originally named Aubrey. Why did I change it? So it was the domino effect. So Madison, Avery, Madison, my agent pointed out, rightly so, this is the change for submission. Madison is a very common name, not just among girls, but in YA novels, including for bitchy characters. And she was like, you probably want something that's going to stand out a bit better. But also, she pointed out, wealthy, privileged families tend not to give their kids names that are super popular at the time. They try to be more unique. And so she was like, Madison was a little too popular the year Avery was born. You should think about a name that her parents would have picked to try to be ahead of the plebes. And so that's how I kind of slid into Avery. And it was a process picking a new name for Avery. Like, we brainstormed a really long list, and like, it was so hard to find one that felt like it fit the character as I had written the character, because she felt like a Madison, but now she feels like an Avery. And then Margot had to become Margot because I wasn't gonna have Avery and Aubrey. Aubrey is just a name I really like. I also love the name Audrey. I was between those two for Margot. As you can tell, I really like French names, and that's why I was like, okay, since I really like this feel, we'll give her a different French feeling name. And I also love the name Margot, so that worked out. So doing those dev edits with my editor, I first tackled the Olivia arc. We will get to the final ending, which that's a whole section unto itself. I ended up rewriting the ending 3 times anyway. Olivia's arc, this created the most ripples in Act 2, as I said, because all of a sudden, instead of a character who's like, I know my friends and I did all these terrible things to people. Here, Ethan, let me make a list because we need to see which of these might have wanted to kill one of us, into, hey, like, you know, you might want to think about who your friends are. Like, I've heard things. What do you mean? And then having to like talk to people to find out what they really thought about her friends. And this is Olivia discovering kind of the depths of what she didn't know and questioning her own role in the friend group. And that's actually what I love most about the change. It just really, it creates a whole different texture for exploring ideas of being an outsider in a class situation, a class-based narrative like this. And it's definitely something that I can relate to, and I think a lot of people can relate to, that moment when you find out like you're the odd man out in your friend group. That the being left off of the text chain, like the other group chat, was always in the Ivies, but it hits different when you change Olivia's arc to realize she was basically a patsy the whole time. So it was I totally, by changing her character arc, I changed the emotional arc. And so all of that work and the ripples that created in the second act, she had more people to talk to. Before, because she knew who they had screwed over, now I had to have her actually figure out who had been screwed over by her friends specifically. So it was adding all of those scenes, which helped so much with tension and pacing in Act 2. Talking to Rebecca, love Rebecca, by the way, Rebecca Ito. If there is a character who is the most like me in terms of perspective, everything Rebecca Ito says at the party, that's me channeling into this book. We love her, and I love thinking that Rebecca like gets to Stanford and is like, Avery's here? We love it. Anyway, maybe they start dating. I don't know. That would be really cute, actually. So, talking to Seth, she always talked to Seth, but it changed texturally when I made the change. Talking to Autumn was a new addition, including having Ethan be a part of that. And with that, I tweaked, added, layered onto all the sabotage. I mean, gosh, coming up with all of the sabotage was a thing. I did kind of like create my own board when I was first drafting this. And so it was like refining those things and like deepening the layers. Also, like a little addition was, so originally I had the whole catfish thing, but it was there, but it didn't do much. And so like adding that teeny tiny thing that it was like something she was actively trying to keep from Ethan, that she didn't want him to find out she had done, because like she didn't want him to know that she'd done something really horrible. Because in the original, remember, she knows that she's horrible. She's a little more laissez-faire about all of that stuff. To that end, my editor also wanted me to beef up the romance with Ethan, so I added some more banter at the party in the beginning. I added their whole interaction after the assembly/memorial/bathroom scene. The irony is I increased the romance and then scuttled it at the end, which I had to warn my editor. Like I sent her an email, and I think we had a phone call where I was like, I just want you to know the implications of this change to your ship. So another thing that I did during dev edits with my editor was fleshing out Emma the victim. This is always something really, really hard about writing a murder book. You're gonna kill a character pretty early on, and you have to find ways to contextualize that character, provide a backstory, like give the reader a real sense of who they are, and it can be challenging. And so we did that. That included, I rewrote all of her early scenes, like not completely, but it's like going over it with a scrub brush, where you're like, okay, if I tweak what she says here slightly, or better describe a look or a reaction here, it'll better characterize this character. I rewrote the scene where she tells her about getting into Harvard to just like fine-tune Emma as a character, because this is also another thing that I do in every draft. I talked about this on a live recently. This applies to both Avery and Emma. I call it the bitch edit. I always have a character in every book who is really kind of evil in my first draft. Sometimes it's the literal bad guy, sometimes not. But like I lean into my worst impulses on a first draft, and they always have to get a bitch edit. It's really a de-bitch edit where I soften them, I make them feel a little more like a real person. Sometimes I pull back on it because I tend to fall in love with these characters. Sometimes it's softening them for foreshadowing purposes so it isn't super obvious as an antagonist. But conversely, I always bitch up my victims. When I first write a book, first of all, I don't always know who my victim is when I start. And they always are decently basic in a first draft. And the challenge you have is you have to dirty up those characters and give them enough like sharp edges that multiple people want to cause them harm, because you need to have lots of different suspects and red herrings. So Emma had this transition. She was kind of sweet as pie on the first draft, and I was like, she's the nice Ivy. And by the end, I was like, she is not the nice Ivy. Though it was playing that like people think she's nice, but she's not really nice. But that meant I had to show that in her character, and she had, you know, very little on page time before she died. So that was a lot of what I worked with my editor on. I added the whole thing with Tyler and the ID machine, which is now one of my favorite things in the book in terms of like foreshadowing, but also just like the whole SAT scam thing. I talked about it before where I was like, it's like I knew, where Olivia's work study job just slotted perfectly into it. And it was this moment in the book where I was like, I need like a tiny, both like ratchet of tension and foreshadowing. I love that scene now. Okay, so before I delight you with the saga of my many endings, we're gonna talk about COVID-19. I talked about this a bit in my Easter eggs video, but so I got my edit letter in January? What is time? No, it was February. It's early February. It's mid-February. Because AMM and Write On Con were happening at the same time, and I got my edit letter. So as you know, the world lit on fire a month later, though of course in February there were those early rumblings. But I started my edit and I was partway through it, and originally I had like 6 weeks to do it. I ended up asking for an extension. I think I actually got multiple extensions. So the point is, the PD happens, we go into lockdown, and I'm at home. And I'm in like the weeds of this dev edit. Like I'm really getting into it. I'm nearing the middle and the end, and I'm beefing it up, and I'm fixing continuity threads and character arcs. And I have an SAT scam in this book, as you know. And the book, wisely or unwisely in hindsight, is set in 2020. Mistakes were made. Fall, like winter 2020. The book starts on December 15th, 2020. Mistakes were made. But I am pretty anal retentive, and through all drafts of the book, when I was referencing SAT dates, they were real dates. And I realized it was the SAT, which is now I think an ACT in the book, where Emma spiked someone's coffee with a diuretic, which by the way was an idea a friend gave me. And I realized this date no longer exists. It was canceled because of COVID. And that's when I was like, I have to make changes. I have to acknowledge this in some way, because it can't just be an SAT scam anymore. It has to be an SAT/ACT scam, because some people, because of COVID, will have taken the ACT instead of the SAT on this timeline. So I started making those changes to make the dates accurate. And then I was like, well, darn. Now the second semester junior year before their senior year will have been at home, partly at home because of COVID. Damn it. So I made those changes. It's like a snowball running downhill. So long story short, I turned in my dev edit. When did I turn in my dev edit? April? May? Dev edits went into May because of the multiple endings for sure. So let's say I turned the first draft in April. Do you remember those halcyon days when we delusionally thought maybe this would be over by summer, and then we delusionally thought maybe this would be over by fall? I do. because it's reflected in the choices I made in the Ivies, for better or for worse. I do like the COVID essay joke I inserted though. No regrets there. The first version of it was meaner than my editor liked, so I actually, the final joke, I said this in the Easter eggs video, like I made it so ridiculous. I made it about like toilet paper and TikToks. It's, yeah. I was in too deep though, man. I was in so deep that like continuity wise, I couldn't undo it cause next thing, like by the time we got to copy edits, I was like, I can't ruin. So the Ivies takes place in an alternate happy universe, or maybe just an entitled universe where this particular boarding school decided it was safe to go back to school. And we just have to go with that. And I know that some people really hate that COVID is in the book, but like, honestly, even if I had said it in 2021, which I should have done, regrets, mistakes were made. But even if I'd said it in 2021, I would have had to address COVID. Like, because it's set in the real world and so much of competitive college admissions is always going to be relative to real world things, both the scandal, which is mentioned in the book, and COVID and how it impacted elite college admissions. So, womp, womp. So let's talk about the ending. So you know about the original ending. So let's talk about the changes. First the process and then the changes. So it was actually, I loved it as a thought experiment. So I had that call with my future editor in October. Yeah, October, late October. Anyway, so I knew from then that this is something I was gonna have to do. So I had like 2.5 months of marination time. And I love marination time for a good idea, because I won't lie. My first reaction on that call wasn't, I love this, yes, but like sheer panic? Sheer panic that I hope I kept hidden smartly from the person who would become my editor, from the people who would become my publisher. I was open to it, but also panicking, just so you know. That's always a first, when you are presented with an extreme edit, panic is a very understandable first reaction. And then marination time. And it's so funny because now I'm in love with the changes I made to the ending, but panic, first response. So I am all about logic. We love logic in a story, and I think especially in a thriller, logic is great. And the original ending was informed by a certain kind of logic, the logic of this parent would bribe someone, blackmail someone, but I went with a bribe to keep this a secret. Yes, okay. So if I work off the thought experiment of, okay, so what if that doesn't happen? You have to think about how things spiral off of each other. And I was like, okay, well, I think even if this came out, the characters with the most privilege and power won't suffer any real consequences. But you know who would suffer consequences? Olivia. Because I had set it up, that Emma had set it up, that Olivia was the perfect fall guy for the SAT scam. Olivia was her golden umbrella, her parachute. Emma really was a terrible person. And I was like, okay, ooh, that sucks. Well, what's next? Ethan. And this is where I had to inform my editor that I was gonna crush her ship under my boot heel. But it was the only thing I could think realistically. I just don't believe. Ethan's not a saint. Ethan is a person. Ethan also doesn't even know Olivia that well. Like, sure, they kissed a few times, but would you throw away your entire future, including your college education, including and especially your admission to Harvard, for a girl you don't even know that well, where it's not even that you have to do anything, you just have to not do anything? Ethan made the choice I think most people would make, to be perfectly frank. He made a very human choice, and that human choice was simply to say nothing. Including because there is a possibility that even if he'd spoken up for her, that Claflin still would have buried it under the rug and used both of them as a scapegoat. Ethan saved his own ass. That is the choice he made. So the next ripple effect is being rescinded from Harvard. I was just like, if your elite boarding school turns on you, I just think this is what's gonna happen. And it's a media story. Whew. So then from there, I was like, ooh, well, if Claflin doesn't technically expel her but asks her to leave, which I think they would do in this worst case scenario, she's screwed for admissions to all her other schools. And this is the snowballer where I was like, okay, Olivia's the fall guy. She's going to not get into any colleges. She's gonna have to take a gap year, and this, I'm just spinning off from this. And so this is where we get the flavor and the texture of this new ending. It is the unhappy ending that ultimately is Olivia's villain origin story. What would you do if this happened to you? I mean, obviously you'd be angry and sad and depressed, and you'd cry about it, and you'd go home and you'd lick your wounds. And then like Olivia has to make a choice. So, you know, I think she's teetering on the knife's edge up until like the ending, the literal ending that I wrote that is in the book. But first draft of this literal ending that is in the book. So all of that, all the repercussions never changed once I changed them. The transition into this new ending. To give you an idea, this first revision of the ending was like 10,000 words. It was multiple chapters, and it had an epilogue. Long story short, it was long. Olivia travels to Boston for the trial. Clearly that didn't change. I have her check into the hotel. She goes to the hotel restaurant to eat dinner. I just love a good food scene, and she runs into Sierra in the restaurant of the hotel, and they have like a hashing out like scene together, like very cathartic. I wanted to give them a very specific kind of hashing out of things, and this is where I've more firmly established what I had come to realize about Sierra's character and how interesting her approach to the Ivies was, and Olivia having to kind of process some of that realization and hurt, but also ultimately acceptance. Then the next day she runs into Paul, the security guard at the coffee shop at the hotel, and she gets the realization that he was blackmailing Tipton. Then she goes to the courthouse and sees Cataldo on the steps. Then Ethan walks up. It was long. Then the documentary producer approached Olivia and she rebuffed her. Then I went into the courtroom. I have all this set up. I skipped the meat of the trial. I did a transition. She sees Avery outside. This was so long. She shares an Uber back to the hotel with Avery. I wrote another dinner scene at the hotel where she gets her hashing it out and resolution with Avery, where Avery has mellowed since going to Stanford and is like kind of chill and cool. And Olivia gets into Smith at the dinner with Avery. And then I transitioned to my epilogue. So that all took place a year later, as it still does in the ending that exists. And then this was 6 months later. In my epilogue, I show her at Smith on her first day of college, and she's being followed by the documentary crew, so you know that she agreed to do the documentary, and I'm showing kind of this false persona she's portraying, and she goes to her dorm room, and you find out Kayla, who is the character who, I mean, it hasn't changed. She's the character who helps her get into Smith. Everywhere else, like, she's blacklisted, but her mom works at Smith. She's the character who used to be friends with the Ivies, and they meet at the Starbucks in Northampton. So she's roommates with Kayla, and it ends on that documentary interview that is familiar in the final ending. It was long. So the feedback I got from my editor was, this is long. You time skip twice. Don't do that. and just compressing. You have 2 different dinner scenes at the hotel over 2 different days with 2 different people. And Margot doesn't make an appearance. My logic being that Margot and Olivia never liked each other so that they wouldn't hang out, which I stand by. But my editor's first suggestion was, it'd be great to see all the Ivies in some sort of resolution. Could she run into all of them at the hotel that first night and have dinner with them? And there were a couple other suggestions as well. It was really like pacing, like feeling like too much, and wanting a reunion with the Ivies at the end were the main notes of like, this ending is getting there, but it's not there. I will tell you, like, immediately, and I talked to my editor about it, I was like, no, there cannot be a reunion dinner with the Ivies. After everything that went down, even though everyone more or less got their happy ending, there's just no way Avery, Sierra, and Margot would ever willingly go to dinner together. They have fallen out with each other as well. Specifically, it's like Avery versus. So I did some pretty brutal streamlining. I cut the whole thing at the hotel the night before the trial. I have her going right to the trial. I still had her run into Cataldo and Ethan on the courthouse steps. I still had her talking to the documentary producer before, but then I added like actual scenes from the trial. I had Paul on the stand to get to the reveal of the blackmailing. I had a really long scene with Sierra on the stand to kind of hit the beats that I had had in the previous dinner scene, because I still wanted to hit those beats of like, she has to get a sense of this friend strategy from the other side, realize things for herself, and come to terms with it in some way. I wanted that sting of betrayal there. I also had Cataldo on the stand basically saying that like Olivia was like an outsider to kind of twist that screw more, of basically just making Olivia feel terrible about herself. I also had a bunch of scenes with Tyler's defense lawyer very actively and clearly trying to create reasonable doubt by pinning it on Olivia. And I had that growing like panic feeling, which pushes her into the bathroom reunion. So the bathroom reunion was the big revelation, the thing I love now, because I was like, all right, I can have them run into each other. There's just no way they're gonna have a reunion dinner. Bathroom scene. And we love mirrors. This is actually a technique. In Save the Cat, they say opening image and closing image. And I am not religious about making sure that your closing image mirrors your opening image, but clearly in the first draft ending, I did the whole cafeteria thing, and there's something poetic to it. So in this case, it's the earlier bathroom meeting of the Ivies and the last bathroom meeting of the Ivies. And I loved how I was able to kind of demonstrate the new character dynamics, work in some like, where are they now kind of little tidbits that I wanted to have in the ending. I have her getting into Smith after the bathroom. That didn't change. This was about 6,000 words, this new ending, and I was really happy with it. Spoiler, clearly I edited it again, but like I was like, this is it. This is the ending. And I turned it into my editor and she told me it was too long. Do we see a trend with me? And I did, like, I was very vulnerable with my editor and I expressed my fear to her. And I said, look, 2 books in a row, many people have found my endings rushed. They have not liked my endings, and I hate a rushed ending in a thriller. And so my fear is rushing this ending. Her first really radical suggestion, by the way, was on the previous version to have the dinner reunion at the hotel and end the book. And I was like, no, rushed ending. I won't do it. So I was vulnerable and she was like, I totally get that. Let's just look for places to tighten what you have now. This 6K, it's not rewriting, but can we trim it a little to get it a little bit tighter? So that is what I focused on doing. So what changed with the final ending? You already know some of it. So I ended up at about 4K, which was just right. I no longer have all that stuff on the courthouse steps. I go right into the trial. There's no Paul on the stand, there's no Cataldo on the stand, it's just Sierra. I really drilled into what was important there. Less grandstanding with the lawyer. There's the break after. That's when she has her interaction with Ethan. Perfect, love it. Actually checking myself, I think she has the interaction with Cataldo before. Essentially, I had to drill down to what character beats were really important to me in the ending so that it would feel satisfying and resolved, but also still a little bit tense. So it was Cataldo for sure. It was Ethan, Sierra, and that kind of moment of realization, Avery, herself individually, and the Ivies as a whole, and the reveal about the security guard blackmail. But I ultimately had it where Sierra says something and I have Olivia figure it out herself. I just wanted to resolve that thread for the reader so it didn't feel like a dropped plot. And then I trimmed, cut / streamlined the whole documentary thing. It was really important to me that the very final scene was Olivia's documentary interview, because what I wanted to portray was the conscious choice that Olivia was making to be her worst self, to lean in and play the game because other people are playing the game. Who is the person that you choose to project to the world, especially in the media, especially on social media, in response to something like this, to build a narrative around yourself so that you can survive? So I changed it to running into the documentary producer after the bathroom, right after she's gotten into Smith, and then I purposefully had that moment that was really important for me to include because it contributes directly to the choices that Olivia makes. Because she can go to Smith or she can go to UMD, University of Maryland, great school. And UMD is definitely the choice to make to get out of this rat race with all of these awful, horrible, backstabbing people. But when she tells the documentary producer that she got into Smith, that she's going to Smith, the documentary producer also went to an elite school, and she changes the way that she looks at her. She looks at her with this approval, like Olivia is one of us. Olivia belongs, and that feeling washes over her. And to my mind, that is when Olivia makes the choice to lie. And by lie, I mean she's going to be contrite and play the good girl character. She's going to say, I regret ever being friends with the Ivies and those horrible things that happened. Whereas in her mind, she doesn't regret it. And that's the whole like thing that I have at the end, because that's what I want to leave people with, and that she does it without blinking, unflinchingly, that she is going to portray a character and play the game as hard as she needs to play it in order to get what she wants. And she desperately wants validation, and she wants to belong, and she's ambitious, and she wants to climb the ladder of success. But at what cost is the question that I want to leave people with. And that is how I landed on the ending, and I turned in that version and very light edits from my editor, and that became the ending. And I love it. I know not everyone loves it, but ultimately, all that matters is how you feel about your ending, I think. And it's the ending that feels really right for the book. And what I love most about it, and it's so bonkers when you think about the original ending and the journey of this book and all the changes that I made with my editor, that it colors the whole book in a very specific light. And it gave the whole book like this very specific intention. And it definitely became the book that I wanted it to be, even though I could have never fathomed in the beginning the choices that I would make to get it there. So yeah, that's kind of like an overview, long and rambling as always. You love it. That's why you're here, of all of the changes that the Ivies went through from first draft to final draft. As I said, you have a chance for yourself to read that original ending. And I mean, I'm hoping you watched all of this because you've actually read this, but I would love to know, once you read the original ending, or really anything that you've heard me talk about here in this video versus reading the book, what surprised you most about what changed over the course of the Ivies? Give this video a thumbs up if you like it, because it helps me in the algorithm, and you know I'm gonna do this again for Pretty Dead Queens. We love our niche, popular niche content on this channel. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. And as always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and happy writing.